There is a kind of silence that only happens in the moments before everything changes. Not a peaceful silence. Not the kind you find at the end of a long day when the house goes quiet and the world feels still. This is a different kind. It is the silence that fills a room when two people sit across from each other, and the air between them holds a truth so enormous, so impossibly heavy, that neither one of them can find a single word that is big enough to carry it. That is the silence that hung over a corner booth in a quiet restaurant in Columbus, Ohio, on a Tuesday evening in the spring of 2023. Two women, one table, two glasses of water that neither of them touched, and beside each glass, placed carefully, deliberately, almost ceremonially, a wedding ring. The same last name engraved on the inside of each band. In 2023, in a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio, two women sat across a restaurant table from each other. They had never met, but they were both wearing the same man's last name. And in 5 minutes, everything they thought they knew about their lives would be gone. This is the story of Marcus Reid, a man who built two complete lives, two homes, two families, two lives, and thought he'd never have to choose. A man who kissed his wife goodbye in Columbus on a Monday morning, boarded a flight to Nashville, Tennessee, and kissed a different wife hello before dinner. A man who remembered two sets of anniversaries, two sets of birthdays, two sets of hopes and dreams and promises, and somehow, for nearly a decade, kept them all from colliding. But the thing about living a double life is, it only takes one moment to collapse it all. One phone call, one Google search, one photograph, and the entire architecture of deception, every carefully constructed lie, every calculated absence, every tender look that was never really meant for the woman receiving it, comes down like a building with its foundation pulled out from under it. Stay with me, because what happened next is not what you were expecting. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Before we get to that restaurant table, before we get to the moment those two women looked each other in the eye for the very first time, you need to understand something. You need to understand how a man like Marcus Reid could carry on a deception of this magnitude for the better part of a decade without being caught. Because here is what we know. Marcus Reid was not some desperate, disheveled man scraping through life. He was not a man running from poverty or fleeing some broken past. He was charming, well-dressed, and by all outward appearances, completely devoted to his family. He coached youth baseball on Saturdays. He remembered to bring flowers on ordinary Tuesdays. He was the kind of man that other men envied and other women admired. And that, as it turns out, was exactly the problem. How did he keep two wives separated for 9 years without either of them ever finding out? Who figured it out first? And what did she do when she did? And what happened at that restaurant table in Columbus in the spring of 2023 that nobody in Marcus Reid's carefully constructed world could have anticipated? These are the questions this story is going to answer. But I am warning you now, the answers are not simple. And the ending is not the one you think is coming. Because the most astonishing part of this story is not what Marcus Reid did. It is what two women chose to do about it. Denise Carter grew up in a small town just outside Dayton, Ohio. The kind of place where everybody knew your name and nobody locked their front door. She was the middle daughter of a schoolteacher and a hardware store owner, and she was raised on the belief that hard work and honesty were the only two currencies that ever held their value. She was not naive. She was not someone who floated through life on wishful thinking. She had a practical mind and a warm heart, and she gave both of them fully to the things and the people she loved. She became an elementary school teacher, 3rd grade, and she was the kind of teacher who bought supplies out of her own paycheck without telling anyone and stayed after school on Fridays when she knew a child was going home to a hard weekend. She did not do it for recognition. She did it because it was right. She was 37 years old when she met Marcus Reid. It was a church fundraiser on a warm September evening in Columbus, and she had gone because her sister Linda had dragged her there, and she had not had the energy to argue. She was not looking for anyone. She had been through one difficult relationship in her early 30s, and she had made her peace with being on her own. She had a small apartment she loved, a routine that suited her, and a belief that if something was supposed to happen, it would happen without her chasing it. And then Marcus Reid walked across the room and introduced himself with a confidence that was not arrogance, but something quieter, something more magnetic than that. And she found herself laughing at something he said before she had even consciously registered that she was enjoying herself. He brought her coffee the next morning. She had not asked him to. She had given him her number at the end of the evening almost as an afterthought, fully expecting never to hear from him again. But at 7:45 the following morning, he was at her door with 2 cups from the diner down the street and a look on his face like there was nowhere else in the world he would rather be. She let him in, and something in her that she had been keeping carefully protected for years quietly opened up. By the 3rd month, he was talking about the future, not in a rushed or pressured way, but in the easy, certain way of a man who already knew where he was headed and was simply letting her know she was welcome to come along. By month 8, he had proposed in her kitchen on a Sunday morning. No fanfare, just a ring on the counter and his eyes searching hers, and she had said yes before she even realized the word was leaving her mouth. They were married the following spring. Denise wore her grandmother's pearl earrings and a dress she had found in a consignment shop and altered herself. Marcus cried at the altar, which she would tell her sister Linda about every year on their anniversary for the next 15 years. They bought a house in a quiet suburb of Columbus with a backyard big enough for the garden Denise had always wanted. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, born 3 years apart. And for all intents and purposes, they were a happy family. Marcus traveled for work. He was a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company, and he was gone every other week. Denise had come to accept the absences as simply the shape their life had taken. She did not love it, but she trusted him. And in the language of Denise's heart, trust was everything. There were small things over the years, moments that tugged at the edge of her attention and then slipped away before she could catch them. A phone call he took in the car when he was supposedly already on the highway. A weekend conference that fell on their son's birthday when he had promised he would be there. A hotel charge in Nashville on his company card for a weekend she could not quite account for when she thought back on it. But every time one of these things surfaced, Marcus had an explanation that was just plausible enough, delivered with just enough calm certainty, that the doubt dissolved before it could take root. She had been raised to believe that suspicion without evidence was the same as accusation, and she would not accuse a man she loved without something real to stand on. That was Denise Reid. Careful, loyal, and completely, entirely deceived. Carol Winters grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, the oldest of 4 children and the one everyone expected to hold things together. She was a natural caregiver, not from weakness but from a genuine, bone-deep desire to be useful to the people around her. She became a registered nurse, and she was extraordinary at it. The kind of nurse who remembered what mattered most to each patient, who sat with families at night when there was nothing left to do but be present, who fought quietly and persistently for patients who did not have the voice to fight for themselves. Her colleagues respected her. Her patients trusted her. She had a reputation in her unit for being the person you wanted in the room when things got hard. By the time Carol was 43, she had been through a difficult divorce from a man she had married too young and too quickly, a man who was not cruel but was absent in all the ways that mattered most. She had spent 2 years rebuilding herself afterward, going to therapy, running every morning before her shift, learning to be comfortable in her own company. She was not bitter. She was not closed off. But she was careful. She had learned to pay attention, to watch for the gap between what people said and what they did, and she had decided that the next time she let someone in, she would make certain he had earned it. She met Marcus Reid in the fall of 2013 at a regional healthcare conference in Nashville. She had gone for a continuing education credit and was sitting alone at a lunch table with a plate she was barely touching, her mind already on the afternoon session, when a man in a dark gray suit sat down across from her without asking and ordered a coffee and said, "I have a feeling this afternoon's panel is going to be exactly as tedious as the mornings, and I think we should have already made friends before we suffer through it together." She looked at him for a long moment, and then, despite herself, she laughed. Marcus told Carol he was a sales rep for a medical device company. He traveled constantly, he said, lived out of hotels half the year, and had been thinking for a while about putting down real roots somewhere. He said Nashville felt like a city with a heartbeat. He said she felt like a person with one too. It was exactly the kind of line that should have made her roll her eyes. Instead, it made something warm move through her chest, and she hated herself a little for it and leaned forward anyway. He proposed 9 months later on the porch of a bed and breakfast outside of Franklin, Tennessee, on a Sunday evening with the fireflies just beginning to come out. Carol said yes. She would spend the next 9 years believing it was the best decision she had ever made. Marcus maintained two addresses. His official home address, which he kept registered in Ohio and claimed was a family property he held for estate reasons, was something Carol never questioned because he always came to her. He was always the one who traveled. He was always the one who drove 4 hours or caught a flight to be with her on weekends, who showed up on her doorstep with her favorite Thai food and a bottle of wine, and that look of relief in his eyes, like seeing her was the thing that made everything else worthwhile. She thought it was romantic. She thought it was devotion. She did not yet know it was logistics. To understand how Marcus Reid maintained 2 complete marriages for 9 years without being caught, you have to understand that this was not luck. It was not charm alone. It was a system, a carefully constructed, meticulously maintained system built on 3 pillars: geography, information control, and the human instinct to trust the person you love. Columbus, Ohio, and Nashville, Tennessee, sit approximately 300 miles apart. A 5-hour drive, a 50-minute flight, far enough that the social circles of 2 women living ordinary lives in their respective cities would never naturally overlap. No shared friends, no shared workplaces, no shared neighborhood coffee shops where someone might recognize a name or a face. Marcus had chosen this distance intentionally. Investigators would later determine that he had mapped it out before he ever proposed to Carol, had already calculated that the geography gave him enough breathing room that the 2 lives would stay cleanly separated as long as he controlled the information flow between them. He maintained 2 cell phones, one for each life. The phones had different numbers, different contacts, different text histories. The Denise phone stayed in a locked console compartment in his car when he was in Nashville. The Carol phone went into a laptop bag pocket when he was in Columbus. He was so disciplined about this that in 9 years he never once sent a message from the wrong phone. He paid for gifts to both women in cash to prevent any paper trail that might surface in a shared bank statement. He used 2 separate email accounts for his personal correspondence. He had crafted, for each woman, a version of his professional life that explained why he traveled so frequently and why she could not always reach him during certain windows of the day. To Denise, he said his territory covered a 6-state region and that certain client visits in Tennessee required him to be off the grid for stretches of time because some of the hospital systems he worked with had strict no-phone policies on the floor. To Carol, he said his family obligations in Ohio were complicated by a mother whose health was declining and who needed him present in ways that were hard to predict. Both women found these explanations unfortunate, but entirely believable. Both women absorbed the inconvenience of his absences into the fabric of their love for him, the way people do when they care about someone and want to extend grace for the hard parts of their lives. He controlled the calendar. This was perhaps the most important element of the entire operation. Marcus was the one who set the dates for visits, for holidays, for family events. He never allowed either woman to surprise him. If Denise suggested an impromptu trip to visit him on the road, he had a reason it would not work. If Carol proposed flying to Ohio to see his hometown, he had a gentle but firm explanation for why now was not the right time. He framed these refusals not as restrictions, but as protection. He was protecting them from the stress of his complicated professional life. He was protecting them from the chaos of travel. And over time, both women came to understand that Marcus simply operated this way, that he was a planner, a man who liked things orderly and scheduled, and that it was one of the qualities that made him so steady and reliable in every other area of their lives. What investigators and psychologists who later examined this case found most striking was not the logistics of what Marcus did, but the psychological precision of it. He had studied both women. He knew what each one needed to feel secure. Denise needed consistency and presence. He gave her routines, predictable rituals, the same takeout order on Friday nights, the same walk after church on Sundays, the same way of reaching for her hand in the dark when he knew she was worried about something. Carol needed to feel chosen. He gave her grand gestures, unexpected arrivals, the sense that she was always the best part of whatever week he was having. 2 different women, 2 different love languages. One man who had turned deception into something that looked, from the inside, indistinguishable from devotion. For 9 years, the system held. And then, In the early months of 2023, something shifted. Not with Marcus. Marcus never slipped. Not once in 9 years did he use the wrong name, call from the wrong phone, or forget which version of himself he was supposed to be on any given day. The crack came from somewhere he had not accounted for. It came from Carol's co-worker, a woman named Teresa. Teresa had known Carol for 11 years. They had worked the same unit together, covered each other's shifts, been there for each other through divorces and illnesses and the ordinary griefs that accumulate over a decade of close friendship. Teresa had met Marcus twice, at Carol's birthday dinner one year and at a hospital fundraiser the following spring. She had liked him well enough, but there was something that had always sat slightly wrong with her, something she could not name. He was too smooth, not in a flashy way, just in the way of someone who had practiced being likable for so long that it had become automatic, like a reflex rather than an instinct. In the winter of 2023, Carol mentioned to Teresa, in passing, that Marcus had missed their anniversary weekend because of an emergency with his mother in Ohio. It was the third significant occasion he had missed in 18 months. Teresa did not say anything in that moment. She just filed it away. A few weeks later, Carol mentioned that she had tried to surprise him by driving to Columbus on a Friday afternoon, just to see his face, just to do something spontaneous for once. And Marcus had called her before she even reached the city limits to say he had been suddenly dispatched to a client site in Indiana and would not be back until Sunday. She had turned around and driven home, 2 hours each way, alone. That was when Teresa went home that evening, opened her laptop, and typed Marcus Reid into a search engine. What she found was not a news article. It was not a criminal record. It was a Facebook profile. A woman named Denise Reid, Columbus, Ohio. 15 years of photographs. A husband in almost every one. The same jaw, the same build, the same easy smile. Teresa sat very still for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Carol. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Carol was in the break room at the hospital, eating a sandwich she did not have time to sit down for, when Teresa called. She answered expecting something about the weekend schedule. What she got instead was a silence on the other end that lasted just long enough to make her stomach tighten before Teresa said, quietly and carefully, "Carol, I need to show you something, and I need you to be sitting down." Teresa sent the screenshots, the Facebook profile, the photos, the name, Denise Reid. Carol stared at her phone screen for a very long time. The sandwich sat untouched in front of her. The break room hummed and moved around her with the ordinary noise of a Tuesday afternoon, and Carol sat perfectly still in the middle of it, looking at a photograph of a woman she had never seen before, standing in a backyard in Columbus, Ohio, beside a man Carol had married 9 years ago in Franklin, Tennessee. He was wearing a blue shirt she had given him for Christmas. She drove home that evening on autopilot. She sat at her kitchen table and she opened her laptop and she did what any intelligent, methodical person does when the world stops making sense. She started looking for evidence. She went through 3 years of credit card statements. She mapped the dates Marcus had been in Ohio for work against the dates visible in the timestamps of Denise Reid's Facebook posts. Every single one lined up. Every weekend Marcus had spent on the road corresponded to a weekend where Denise had posted a photo at a family birthday, a school event, a Sunday afternoon in that same Columbus backyard. There was no gap. Not one. He had spent those weekends not traveling for work, but living his other life, sitting at another woman's kitchen table, sleeping in another woman's bed, being a father to children Carol had not known existed. She pulled out a calendar and accounted for every weekend of the past year. She found the hotel charges in Columbus that Marcus had explained as client dinners. She found the gap in his phone records during the hours he was allegedly unreachable on hospital floors. She found a receipt, tucked in the back of his car's center console, from a hardware store in a suburb of Columbus, for a garden hose and a bag of mulch. She had thought, when she found it months ago, that it was from a client site visit and had thrown it back in the console without another thought. She took it out now and looked at it for a long time. It was dated on a Sunday. He had told her he was in Indianapolis that Sunday. By midnight, Carol had filled 4 pages of a legal pad with dates, discrepancies, and questions. By 2 in the morning, she had cross-referenced every significant absence of the past 3 years. By 4 in the morning, she had a picture so complete, so internally consistent, so devastatingly clear that there was no room left in it for any interpretation that did not lead to the same conclusion. She had been married for 9 years to a man who was also married to someone else. She had not been his wife. She had been his second life. Most people, when they find themselves in possession of information this destructive, do one of two things. They call a lawyer or they call their mother. Carol did neither. She sat at that kitchen table as the sun came up over Nashville, and she thought about the woman in those photographs. She thought about what it would mean to know, and she thought about what it would mean not to. And at 7:38 in the morning, she picked up her phone and called the number listed on Denise Reid's public Facebook page. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when it came, was steady too. She had been a nurse for 20 years. She had learned to be steady when everything around her was falling apart. Denise answered on the third ring. She was in her car, on her way to school, a cup of coffee in the cup holder, and the radio playing something she would never be able to remember afterward. She said hello the way you say hello to a number you do not recognize. Guarded, a little impatient. Carol said, "My name is Carol. I'm calling because I believe we may know the same man. And I think you deserve to know what I know." There was a very long silence. And then Denise pulled her car to the side of the road and turned the radio off. And she said the three words that would change both their lives. "I'm listening." That first phone call lasted 4 hours. Denise sat in her parked car on a side street in Columbus for 4 hours, and the two women talked. They compared dates. They compared excuses. They compared the lies Marcus had told each of them and discovered, with a cold and mounting horror, that the lies were not even original. He had used the same explanations in both households. The same story about his mother's declining health. The same reason for being unreachable on certain mornings. Even some of the same phrases. "I just want to protect you from all the chaos of this," he had said to Carol. He had said the exact same words to Denise. Word for word. Like a script he had committed to memory so long ago that he could deliver it without thinking. By the time they hung up, Denise had missed the entire school day, and Carol had called in for her evening shift. They had agreed on two things. First, that they would not confront Marcus yet. And second, that they needed proof that would hold up to whatever Marcus threw at them when they did. Because they both knew, without having to say it aloud, that a man capable of 9 years of seamless deception would not simply fold when confronted. He would have an explanation. He always had an explanation. They hired a private investigator within the week. Not together at first. Denise hired one through a recommendation from her sister Linda, and Carol hired one independently in Nashville. When they compared notes 3 days later and discovered they had contacted investigators in the same regional firm, they took it as confirmation that they were thinking along exactly the same lines. They consolidated their cases and worked through a single investigator from that point forward, pooling everything they had and building a timeline so precise, so thoroughly documented, that it left no room for doubt and no room for escape. The investigator confirmed both marriage licenses within 48 hours. Ohio, 2008. Tennessee, 2014. Marcus Reid. The same man. The same signature. 2 legal ceremonies, 2 sets of witnesses, 2 legally binding contracts, one of which was a felony the moment it was signed. They obtained phone records that showed the 2 phones operating within the same geographic area on multiple occasions, evidence that Marcus had been physically present in Columbus while Carol believed he was traveling, and in Nashville while Denise believed he was on a work trip. They had surveillance photographs of Marcus entering and leaving Carol's address in Nashville on a Thursday evening and then disembarking from a flight at John Glenn Columbus International Airport 14 hours later and going directly to Denise's home, where he was filmed kissing her on the front porch and carrying in grocery bags. They also discovered something that shook both women deeply. Marcus Reid had not invented this pattern for himself. In 2005, in Indianapolis, Indiana, a woman named Rebecca had filed a police report against a man matching Marcus Reid's description for emotional manipulation and financial fraud in the context of a romantic relationship. The report had never led to charges. The woman had ultimately moved away and the case had been closed. Marcus had been 29 years old at the time. He had been practicing for a very long time. Before we go further, there is something important that needs to be said about what happened in the days between when Carol and Denise assembled their evidence and when they acted on it. Because what happened in those 4 days is, in some ways, the most psychologically revealing part of this entire story. When Marcus realized, through a casual comment Denise made that she later could not even fully recall, that something was slightly off in her manner toward him, he acted immediately. He did not get defensive. He did not get angry. He got calm. And then he got ahead of it. He called Denise first. He told her that a woman named Carol, a former professional acquaintance, had apparently been spreading rumors about him and that he had heard she might try to contact Denise. He said the woman had developed what he described as an unhealthy fixation on him after a mentoring relationship at work and that he had been advised by HR to have no contact with her. He was apologetic, a little weary, the way a man sounds when he is dealing with something embarrassing he had hoped would resolve itself. He said he should have told her sooner. He said he was sorry for not being more forthcoming. Denise listened and said very little. Inside, she felt the first tremor of doubt. Not doubt about Carol. Doubt about herself. About whether she was about to do something terrible to a man who did not deserve it. He called Carol within the hour. He told her that Denise was a former girlfriend from many years ago, before Carol, with whom he had maintained an uncomfortable but unavoidable co-parenting arrangement for a mutual friend's children. He said things had recently become complicated and that Denise had been making contact with people in his professional circle in ways that concerned him. He said he should have been more transparent about this part of his past. He said he was sorry. Carol listened, and she felt it too. That tiny, terrible voice that lives in the back of every person who has ever been in love with someone. The one that says, "What if you are wrong? What if you are about to blow up your life and someone else's life over a mistake?" For 4 days, both women sat with that doubt. They did not speak to each other during those 4 days. Each was alone with the evidence on one side and the doubt on the other, trying to decide which one to trust. And then, on the 5th day, the private investigator delivered the photograph. A single image, time-stamped on a Sunday morning in February 2023. Marcus Reid walking out of Denise's front door in Columbus at 7:42 in the morning, kissing her on the cheek. Then getting into his car and driving directly to the Columbus airport. Then, 14 hours later, walking through the front door of Carol's home in Nashville, where she is standing in the kitchen and he crosses to her and holds her face in his hands the way he always does. The same day, the same man, 2 different women, 2 different doors, and the doubt was gone. Carol called Denise the morning after they received the photograph. She did not say much on the phone. She did not need to. She said, "Are you free this weekend? I think it is time we met in person." Denise said yes. She drove to Columbus herself. They chose a restaurant in a quiet part of the city, a small Italian place that had been open for 30 years and was usually half empty on Tuesday evenings. Denise arrived first and chose a corner booth away from the windows. She sat with her hands folded on the table and she waited. She would describe it later as the strangest waiting she had ever done. She was waiting to meet a woman who was, legally and technically, her husband's other wife. She did not know what Carol looked like except from a few photographs on the investigator's file. She did not know what Carol's voice sounded like in person. She did not know if they were going to sit across from each other in silence, or cry, or yell, or say nothing at all. She had brought her sister Linda with her and asked her to wait in the parking lot. "I needed to do this part myself," she would say later. "I did not know why at the time. I just knew it had to be me." Carol walked in at 7:15. She was wearing a gray coat, and she moved the way nurses move, purposefully but quietly, with a steadiness that did not draw attention to itself. She saw Denise immediately, and Denise saw her. And something happened in that moment that neither of them had anticipated and that both of them would spend a long time afterward trying to describe. They recognized each other, not from photographs, from something else, from the particular way each of them was holding herself, the careful composure of someone who has been through something enormous and is holding it together by sheer force of will. They had the same posture. They had the same careful, measured look in their eyes. They had been shaped, over 9 years, by the same man's love and the same man's lies, and it showed in the way they carried themselves in a way that no photograph could have captured. They hugged before either of them spoke a word. Carol crossed to the booth and Denise stood up, and they held each other for a long moment in the middle of a restaurant neither of them had ever been to before, 2 strangers who were not strangers at all. And then they sat down and placed their wedding rings on the table between them and looked at each other and began. The conversation lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. The waitress, who later described both women as the most polite and composed customers she had served that year, refilled their water glasses 4 times and brought them a dessert they did not order and could not eat. They talked about the first day they each met Marcus. They talked about the way he proposed to each of them. and discovered that both proposals had involved him cupping their faces in his hands before he asked. The same gesture, the same choreography, rehearsed and delivered and received as something singular and irreplaceable both times. They talked about the children Denise had raised while Marcus came and went. They talked about the years Carol had put into a marriage she had believed was the most honest relationship of her adult life. At some point in the conversation, without either of them quite marking the moment it happened, they stopped talking about Marcus Reid altogether. They started talking about what came next. Not what they would do to him, but what they would do for themselves. Carol was the one who first said the word lawyer. Denise was the one who said police. They looked at each other across the table, and something settled between them, quiet and firm and certain. They were not going to handle this privately. They were not going to absorb it and move on and pretend it had not happened, the way women in their position are so often expected to do. They were going to put it on record, every piece of it, because what Marcus Reid had done was not just a personal betrayal. It was a crime, and it deserved to be treated as one. They filed a joint bigamy complaint with the Columbus Police Department 8 days after the restaurant meeting. The detective assigned to the case, a woman with 17 years in the Special Victims Unit, would later say it was one of the most thoroughly documented complaints she had ever received. Carol and Denise did not arrive with a vague accusation and a feeling. They arrived with 214 pages of evidence. Phone records, credit card statements, the investigator's surveillance report, both marriage certificates, a timeline covering 9 years of documented absences cross-referenced against Marcus Reid's movements. They had done everything but write the arrest warrant themselves. The detective filed for an arrest warrant the following week. Marcus Reid was taken into custody at his office in Columbus on a Thursday morning in April of 2023. He was wearing a blue tie. He did not resist. He did not make a scene. He was processed quietly, efficiently, and without the kind of dramatic collapse that might have given the people who loved him some small satisfaction. He looked, according to the officer who processed him, like a man who had always known this day was coming and had made his peace with it a long time ago. Which, in hindsight, may have been the most chilling detail of all. He was charged with bigamy, a felony in the state of Ohio, with a maximum sentence of 7 years. His attorney entered a not guilty plea at the arraignment. Marcus sat at the defense table with his hands folded and his face composed and looked straight ahead, and for the first time in 9 years, there was no version of himself to perform. There was only him, and the courtroom, and the truth, which was already everywhere. The trial lasted 6 days. On the final day, when the verdict was read and the sentence handed down, there were 2 women seated in the gallery. Not behind the prosecution table, not behind the defense table. In the middle of the gallery, in the 4th row, side by side. Denise was on the left. Carol was on the right. They were holding hands. The judge looked at them from the bench and later said, in an interview he gave to a legal journal the following year, that in 31 years on the bench he had never once seen the 2 wives in a bigamy case seated together. He said it changed the tenor of the entire proceeding. It said, without a single word, that this case was not about a competition between 2 women. It had never been about that. It was about one man's choice to treat 2 lives as raw material for his own convenience, and 2 women's refusal to let that choice go unnamed. Marcus Reid looked at them once when he was let in. Just once. And then he looked away. And he did not look at them again for the entire day. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 20 months. Both marriages were legally annulled. His assets were divided in civil proceedings that followed. His attorney stated afterward that his client accepted the verdict and would not be pursuing an appeal. The press coverage was brief. It was not a sensational case in the headlines, not a case involving violence or celebrity, just a man who had lied for a very long time and 2 women who had made certain he answered for it. But in the community of people who knew Denise and Carol, it was not a brief story at all. Here is the part of this story that nobody talks about in the coverage of bigamy cases. The coverage tends to end at the verdict. The man is sentenced, the marriages are dissolved, and the story concludes with the clean finality of a courtroom's judgment. But real life does not operate that way. Real life continues. And for Denise and Carol, what came after the verdict was in many ways more significant than the trial itself. The 2 women kept talking. Not because they had to. Not because there was still legal business to sort through, though there was plenty of that. They kept talking because something had grown between them in those months of shared investigation and shared grief and shared determination that neither of them had a word for, but both of them recognized as real. They had been stripped of the same illusion. They had built the same evidence. They had sat in the same courtroom and held the same hand and watched the same man be held accountable for what he had done. They had been through something together that most people go through entirely alone, and the bond that had formed in that shared experience was not something either of them was willing to walk away from when the legal proceedings ended. Denise went back to teaching third grade. She took a personal leave of absence for 3 weeks after the trial and spent most of it in her garden, planting tomatoes and peppers and a row of sunflowers along the back fence, and slowly, carefully, learning what it felt like to inhabit her own life without the constant background hum of deception that she had not even known was there until it was gone. She reverted to her maiden name, Denise Carter, and she put the wedding ring in a drawer and eventually moved it to a box in the attic and finally, on a Saturday morning about 8 months after the trial, brought it to a jeweler and had the gold melted down and made into a small pair of earrings for her daughter. She thought it was important that something beautiful come out of it. She thought her daughter deserved that. Carol took a week off and drove to the Great Smoky Mountains by herself and hiked every morning until her legs ached and her mind went quiet. She called her mother from a trailhead on the 4th day and cried in a way she had not let herself cry throughout the entire investigation and trial. Great heaving sobs that echoed off the mountain and went nowhere and did not need to. Her mother drove up and met her that evening, and they sat on the porch of a rented cabin, and her mother said, quietly and without drama, "That man took 9 years from you. Now take the rest for yourself." Carol said it was the most useful thing anyone said to her in the entire aftermath. 6 months after the trial, Carol and Denise started a private online community for women who had experienced relationship deception. They did not advertise it. Carol mentioned it to 2 women in her hospital unit who had shared their own quiet stories with her after the trial, and word spread the way these things do, quietly and urgently through the particular network of women who have carried things alone for too long and are looking for a place to set them down. Within 3 months, the group had over 800 members. Within a year, it had grown to more than 3,000 from 47 states and 11 countries. Women who had discovered secret families. Women who had been told they were the only one and had later counted 4, 5, 6 others. Women who had never told anyone because they were afraid of not being believed, or of being blamed, or of the particular loneliness of saying something that sounds impossible and watching the person you told it to look at you like you must have missed the signs. Denise and Carol ran the group together from their respective cities, trading the administrative tasks the way you trade them in a partnership that has developed its own natural rhythm. They had video calls every Sunday evening. They had spent Thanksgiving together the previous fall, Denise driving to Nashville and Carol making the turkey, and both of their families crowded around a table that was, by any conventional measure, the most unconventional family gathering either of them had ever attended. Carol's niece asked how they knew each other. Carol thought about it for a moment, and then she said, "She is someone who was there for me when I needed it most," which was entirely true and, at the same time, the most significant understatement of the year. This is the part of the story where I want to speak directly to you. Not about Marcus Reid, not about what he did or how he did it, but about the question that nearly every person asks when they hear a story like this. Why didn't she know? Why didn't she see it? And I want to answer that question carefully, because it deserves a careful answer. The short answer is this: the signs were there. In retrospect, looking back with the clear, unobstructed vision that only comes after the truth has already arrived, both Denise and Carol can identify moments that should have registered as wrong. They know that now. They have said so themselves, in the support group and in private, and in the conversations they have had with the investigator and the therapists they have each worked with since the trial. But here's the thing about hindsight. It is completely useless as a tool for preventing the thing it is looking back at. Because in the moment, those signs did not look like signs. They looked like life. They looked like the ordinary imperfections of an ordinary relationship with an ordinarily complicated person. He always came to them. He never let them come to him. He framed this as consideration, as not wanting to put them to the trouble of travel, as a preference for being the one who made the effort. In the context of a relationship with a man who seemed devoted and attentive in every other way, this was not a red flag. It was a feature. He controlled the calendar. He was the planner, the organizer, the one who made sure their time together was structured and intentional. This is what we tell women a thoughtful partner looks like. He was minimally present on social media. He explained this as a professional preference, a discomfort with oversharing, a privacy instinct. In an era when social media performance is increasingly understood as its own kind of dishonesty, this seemed, if anything, like a mark in his favor. His phone was always face down. His calls were sometimes taken privately. He occasionally had stretches of several hours when he was unreachable. He had explanations for every one of these things, and the explanations were just plausible enough, just specific enough, just delivered with just enough regret and just enough openness that they felt like answers rather than evasions. This is what psychological researchers who study coercive deception call plausible opacity. The deliberate construction of a personal narrative that is technically possible to verify, but practically difficult to disprove, delivered by someone who has calculated exactly how much truth to include to make the lie feel solid. What Denise and Carol both emphasize, consistently and firmly, when they speak about this is that the failure was not theirs. They were not inattentive. They were not gullible. They were intelligent, perceptive, accomplished women who had been deliberately and systematically deceived by someone who had spent years studying how to deceive them effectively. The system Marcus built was designed specifically to circumvent exactly the kind of careful, observant attention that both women brought to their marriages. The lesson of this story is not that they should have been more suspicious. The lesson is that there are people in the world who view the trust of others not as something to be honored, but as a resource to be harvested. And the only reliable defense against that is not suspicion. It is knowing what you know, saying what you see, and having people around you who will take you seriously when you say it. Teresa did that for Carol. Linda did that for Denise. The friend who pays attention. The person who files something away and comes back to it because it still does not sit right. We talk a lot in our culture about trusting your instincts. What we talk about less is having the right people around you who are paying attention to theirs on your behalf. That is what ultimately broke 9 years of seamless deception. Not a sophisticated investigation. Not a police tip. A friend who typed a name into a search engine because something had been sitting wrong with her for months, and she finally decided it mattered enough to look. Marcus Reid was released from prison on parole after serving 20 months of his 4-year sentence. He had completed a behavioral intervention program during his incarceration. His parole conditions included mandatory counseling and restrictions on financial transactions above a certain threshold, a condition that had been added at the request of the prosecuting attorney after it emerged during the civil proceedings that Marcus had, over the course of his 2 marriages, accumulated a significant amount of undisclosed debt by borrowing against assets in both households simultaneously. He is not remarried. He has not, as of the time this story was reported, made any public statement about what he did. Denise Carter is still teaching 3rd grade in Columbus. She went back to her classroom 3 weeks after the trial and discovered, as she had suspected she would, that being in a room full of 8-year-olds who need her presence and her patience and her steady, unfussy kindness was exactly the right medicine for everything she was carrying. She told her children, her actual children, her son and daughter, the truth in an age-appropriate way when they were ready to hear it. Her son, who was 14 at the time, asked her one question. He asked her whether she was going to be okay. She told him yes, and she meant it. She planted a larger garden the following spring. She filled the section of the backyard where Marcus used to keep his grill with raised beds and grew more tomatoes than she could eat and gave the excess to the families of her students and to the food pantry at her church. She went on one date, about a year after the annulment was finalized, with a man her sister Linda introduced her to, a high school history teacher who was recently divorced and kind in an uncomplicated, unhurried way. She told him, on their second date, a condensed version of what had happened to her. He listened without interrupting, and then he said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." She thought it was a good sign. Carol Winters was remarried in the spring of 2025 in a small ceremony in Nashville with about 40 people present, which was exactly the number she wanted. Denise flew in for the wedding and sat in the front row and cried, which she would later describe, when telling the story, as the best crying she had ever done. Carol's new husband is a physician she met through work, a man who, she said in the toast at their rehearsal dinner, has never once placed his phone face down on a table in her presence. The room laughed. Carol laughed too. And there was something in that laughter, something bright and unguarded and entirely earned, that told everyone in the room everything they needed to know about where she had arrived. Their support community is still active and still growing. Denise and Carol have been invited to speak at 2 domestic awareness conferences in the past year. They have declined the invitations that would require them to be public figures in a way they are not comfortable with. But they have accepted smaller speaking engagements, panels and workshops, and intimate conversations with groups of women in exactly the situations they once found themselves in. They do not offer advice. They offer presence. They offer the knowledge that it is survivable. They offer the particular and irreplaceable comfort of being seen by someone who actually understands. I have thought about this story for a long time, about what it means and what it does not mean. It does not mean that love is a trap. It does not mean that trust is naive or that devotion is foolish or that the women who give themselves fully to the people they love are somehow less equipped for the world than the ones who hold back. What it means, I think, is something both simpler and harder than that. It means that there are people in this world who will look you in the eye and speak the language of love with absolute fluency and feel nothing of what that language is supposed to mean. And there is no diagnostic test for that. There is no checklist that reliably distinguishes the person who loves you from the person who has decided that your love is something they can use. What Denise and Carol did, in the end, was not just about Marcus Reid. It was about refusing to make his deception the private burden of the people he had deceived. It was about insisting that the truth mattered, even when the truth was ugly and the process of establishing it was long and expensive and exhausting. It was about the radical, ordinary, quietly powerful act of 2 women deciding that they owed each other more than they owed the story Marcus had told about each of them. He had needed them to not know each other. He had needed them to remain separate, isolated, each one complete in her ignorance of the other. The moment they chose each other instead, his entire architecture collapsed. Not because of anything dramatic, because of a phone call, because one woman decided another woman deserved to know the truth. Denise said something once, in one of their early conversations, that Carol has repeated more times than she can count. She said, "I spent 15 years loving a man who did not exist. And then I spent 1 year learning that the most important relationship I would ever have was the one I was building with myself." I do not think there is anything I can add to that. I do not think anything I could say would be more honest or more true or more useful than those 2 sentences. So I want to leave you with this. If you are watching this and something in this story has landed somewhere tender in you, somewhere that feels less like entertainment and more like recognition, I want you to know that what you feel is valid. And if there is something in your own life that has been sitting slightly wrong, some explanation that has always been just plausible enough but has never quite resolved, I want you to know that paying attention to that is not paranoia. It is intelligence. It is the same intelligence that Teresa acted on when she opened her laptop and typed a name. And it is the same intelligence that saved both of these women from another decade of living inside someone else's lie. Was justice truly served? Was 4 years, reduced to 20 months on parole, sufficient weight for 9 years of calculated, sustained deception against 2 women who had given Marcus Reid their complete and wholehearted trust? I will leave that question with you. Tell me what you think in the comments. And tell me this. If you had been Carol on that first morning, looking at those photographs, knowing what they meant, would you have picked up the phone and called Denise? Or would the fear of what you might hear have kept you from dialing? There is no wrong answer, but I think how you answer it tells you something important about yourself. Thank you for watching Story Nest. This story, every detail of it, is based on real documented cases of bigamy in the United States, composited and reconstructed to protect the identities of the real women who lived through it. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are not yet subscribed, please do that now. We have a new story coming that I genuinely believe is one of the most extraordinary things we have ever brought to this channel. I think you are going to want to be here for it. I will see you in the next one.